was a whole new tone, and it was a new era in the American presidency in this sense, that while John Kennedy was our first television president, really, television existed before President Eisenhower, for all of his greatness, which I think was considerable, he was terrible on television. But President Kennedy was the first television president, but he only was president 1,000 days. President Johnson came in, wasn't good on television, didn't like television, was not fitted for television, tried his best thing. We didn't have presidential debates in 1964, as you know, as we'd had in 1960. What came with the Nixon presidency, and partly because President Nixon was a good student, particularly a good student of politics. I know a lot of people don't like him, but President Nixon came to the American presidency about as well prepared as any president of the 20th century, in the sense that he studied it very hard. But in order to come back from the political dead, Lazarus-like, as President Nixon did, he had to become a close student of the new media. New media to you and me today means something different, the internet, but in those days, which was television. He had among his principal advisors H.R. Bob Haldeman, who was an advertising man and knew a lot about television. I think Roger Ailes, who's gone on to become president of Fox and be involved in. Anyway, with Nixon's interest in bringing himself back, all the way back, using in the campaign the theory and the theme, we don't want to step into any environment that we don't control. This was something new. Lyndon Johnson never thought, I don't think he thought about, if so he didn't think through. He was so visceral, whether one likes him or not, or approves of it or not, he was so visceral, he really couldn't contain himself. He's going to be accessible. And he was, in many ways, the most accessible president we've had during the television age, bar none. One could say, well, that had to do with his ignorance. Well, nobody ever accused Richard Nixon of being dumb. I certainly don't. So for his campaign, it was we need to have, insofar as we can, a totally controlled environment. We're going to bring control and discipline and marry it to the new television age. And they did so during the campaign. One can make a case, and I'd be here to make the case in another environment, that this was one of the most important keys to Richard Nixon winning the presidency. Well, having used this during the campaign, such things as, let's just don't go in a crowd of people, let's get a crowd of people, we handpick them, and we get them in a studio. And we pretty much know what the questions are going to be, and we know what the answers are going to be. It was their equivalent of lawyers saying, don't ever step into a courtroom, and don't cross-examine or examine a witness. You don't know the answer to everything he's going to answer. It was their equivalent of it. So when they come to the presidency, having succeeded in the campaign, they felt, and I think rightly so, that we're going to be the first presidency in this new television age. Yes, John Kennedy was great on television, but it's more than that. It's the total television environment. And H.R. Haldeman, who became chief of staff at the White House, the former advertising man, very smart person, and others, worked with Richard Nixon, in effect saying to him, I don't know that they ever said this to him in these words, in effect saying, look, you're not John Kennedy on television. You're smart, you're better than Kennedy will ever be, so forth and so on. But the key to having you come across on television as best possible is pick the environment, rehearse, control the environment, and only appear in controlled circumstances. Now, there were many other facets to this, such as you have to have complete control over those who speak for you. Haldeman picked one of his advertising aides, Ron Ziegler, a good and decent man, and pretty good at what he did. But before, and this is the point, before the Nixon presidency, press secretaries were there to help advise the president about how to handle the press, and in the later years, including television, to be part of his strategy, say, this is what I'm hearing from the guys in the press, this is how I think you ought to handle it. The president would have other people. But the Nixon presidency was the first to bring a staff announcer, as we would call it, to be press secretary. Ron Ziegler didn't affect policy. He wasn't there to affect policy. Frankly, he was smart enough that they could have and should have listened to him more. He was not a dumb fellow at all. But Haldeman picked him to be the staff announcer, that he was to go out and stick to the script that they gave him each day, and no matter what happened, no matter what question was asked, his instructions were, you give him this answer. So they brought that, and they brought it to the whole presidency. I hope this is making some sense. It was, we have to assert control. Either the press is going to control you, or you're going to control the press. And this was so deeply embedded in the Nixon presidency from the beginning. The other was be aggressive. Never be in a defensive position with the press. On the offensive all the time. And for the first moment, I remember being very surprised, and I was surprised. I didn't know Richard Nixon. I had never covered him to any great extent. Yes, I had met him and going back to the 60 campaign, but I didn't really know him. And I bore him no ill will whatsoever. Somebody hearing this who was alive at the time may scoff at it for what happened later. But this was a situation. I had covered Lyndon Johnson. I certainly was not one of President Johnson's favorites. Had a lot of difficulty with him. As any trying to be bold and, yes, sometimes aggressive reporter will have trouble with the president. I had my problems with President Johnson. Also, what I really thought was that, well, a new president from a different party may bring a different spirit to the country, and the country badly needed it. So I remained the White House correspondent when Richard Nixon got elected, and I was looking forward to covering him. And somebody knew. Mike Wallace, who was a big Nixon person, had set up a little come get to know Richard Nixon party in New York, to which I was invited, but unfortunately my mother died and I was not able to be at that. So anyway, I remember very well in the first weeks of the Nixon presidency, we'd made a little trip somewhere, and I sat down, and one of the assistants to Haldeman, a former newspaper man, also a good guy, sat down with me. And, he said a version of what Haldeman himself said to me later, which was, Dan Rather, don't think we don't know who you are. You're an old-fashioned Texas Yellow Dog Democrat and a big Johnson supporter. We know who you are and what you are, and we're watching you every moment. I couldn't have been more surprised if a giraffe had come running through the coffee shop, because anybody who knew me knew those things were not true. And particularly given the difficulty I had with President Johnson, that it really took me aback. But I got to thinking about it, particularly after Haldeman himself later told me the same thing. We know who you are, what you are, this is what you are, and we were watching you every moment. I took it as a warning. I think it was intended to be a warning. But when I got to think about it, this is new time. They want you to be on the defensive all the time. They're thinking offense. It's don't let them push you, the press. You push them and stay on top of them. And if not cower them, at least make them think twice about asking any question. And for the first 2 years of the Nixon presidency, I'm sorry to say, and I do not accept myself from this criticism, access is important to reporters. And the White House press corps was smaller in those days, and we all made efforts to demonstrate, listen, we're reasonable. We have a job to do here, but we're reasonable. But right away, from the start, they started picking people whom they thought, rightly or wrongly, were friendly to them, and provide them access, and say to everybody else, you got to earn it. And the way you earn it is be nice, send a Valentine. And that worked from the election time in 68 through 69 and some of 70. It didn't change dramatically. It didn't change dramatically until the widespread criminal conspiracy, which we now put under the sort of slogan of Watergate, was exposed.
Mm-hmm.
But they were successful for a long time.